All right. It is quiet, so we'll go ahead and start. If you'll be turning in your Bibles, we're going to look at Romans 3, and then after that, we're going to spend quite a bit of time kind of in the middle to end of Hebrews, kind of chapter 9 and 10. So if you want to put your finger there in Hebrews 9 and 10, and then we're going to look at Romans 3 first, so if you want to be turning there. We've got some visitors here. They're visiting with us. What we are looking at in the class here is God's plan of redemption. So in the garden, things were broken. Man fell from grace. Sin entered into the world. And what is God's work in resolving that problem? What is His plan and how that should be resolved? And then what has He done to help accomplish that? What we're looking at, we've looked at a lot of things. We're nearing the end of the class. One thing, just real quick, side note. So I think it was 3 weeks ago, we looked at the story of David and Goliath. So we can see these ideas of God's redemption and glimpses of Jesus in the Old Testament. We looked at the story of David and Goliath and how our perception of that story is skewed because we often insert ourselves as David conquering all of our foes. And in the story, we are the Israelites. Jesus is David, who comes in and conquers the foe that's too big for us to fight, which is sin. We looked at that. I gave some examples of how our current pop culture is kind of skewed that. And one of the examples I gave was every sports movie ever. And no one would, in fairness, nobody would watch the movie where one team has all the money and all the giant players and are undefeated, and then they just go beat up on the 3A football team from high school. That wouldn't be a good movie. Nobody would watch that. An example that I gave, and we clicked through a lot of examples, one of those was Hoosiers, and I watched Hoosiers last night. So we watched Hoosiers last night. In Hoosiers, Gene Hackman is the underdog coach who is coming in to coach the underdog basketball team who's lost their star player. I was watching the movie, and I'm like, well, yep, that's what I said. And right before, if you've watched Hoosiers, it really is I had never seen it before last night. It actually is a pretty good show. I like Gene Hackman. Right before the state championship, they never thought they would get all the way to the state championship. Beginning of the season, they didn't even think they were going to come out on the winning side. They make it all the way to state championship. Gene Hackman comes in and he gives his little inspirational speech. And then they said, Coach, it's time to take the court. He goes, all right, hold on, we've got to get the preacher in. So the little small town preacher comes in and prays for the team before it starts. And do you know what he prays? He says, we pray for victory and all these things. And then he quotes 1 Samuel. And he says, and then David went and he picked up a small stone and he went out and he conquered Goliath. And I'm like, that's what I was talking about. So in Hoosiers, there's an underdog coaching an underdog, and the preacher references David and Goliath. He's saying, look, we are telling you. It's not Eric conjecturing. In the movie, they tell you this is what we're talking about. So I felt that was a small victory for me whenever he quoted David and Goliath in Hoosiers last night. We are going to look at tonight, so we've made our way through a lot of this. As we wrap up the class, we have just a few more class periods here. What we're going to be looking at this morning is the question of why did Jesus have to die? So when we look at like God's plan of redemption, it's one thing to say, well, because of justification and sanctification and propitiation and the forgiveness and Jesus being the perfect sacrifice, like all of those things are fine and well, but if you don't start at the foundation of there needing to be a sacrifice, well, then none of it makes any sense. And so we're going to look at this morning the question of why did Jesus have to die? Why did God, okay, I see that you're making the case, this was God's plan, but why didn't God just make a different plan, would be the question. And so that's what we're gonna kind of start wrestling with this morning. Before we start, I've asked Steve if he'd lead us in prayer.
Saved sacrifice of your Son. We thank you for this salvation, for the forgiveness of sins that we have through them. Father, be with the teachers at this time. Help them to present your word in a way that we can take it in, to apply it to our lives, and to serve you better. These things we ask in your Son's name. Amen.
Amen. As we start, so question for the group. Have you ever been a parent and not known how to handle an unruly child? Okay, now what I don't mean is like exasperated, like, oh, I just don't even know what to do, or I know what to do and it's just going to cause a bunch of drama and so I don't want to. That's not what I mean. I mean not as like small children, but, and I keep telling parents, they're like, oh, I can't wait until they grow out of this phase. They don't grow out of phases. They just grow into different phases, okay? I mean as teenagers, as trying to parent, young adult children. Have you ever been faced with a problem that you legitimately didn't know how to counsel them? They have a problem. You say, I just don't know what to do with this. I'm trying to balance grace and justice, and I don't know how to best handle that. So raise your hand if you've ever been in a situation as a parent where you faced that. Has anyone ever had their feelings hurt, or you've been wronged in some way and not known how to handle the situation? Should be everybody. Even if you didn't raise your hand, I know it's true. All right, so have that in the back of your mind. We're going to come back to it in a few minutes. Okay, so just kind of put that in a box, kind of be mulling over that situation that you faced. We're like, here's this problem. There is, we talked about the reconciliation part of what God accomplished. This relationship has been injured, and I don't know what to do to fix it. I don't know what I want the other person to do, and I don't know what I should do. Or as a parent, I have an unruly child, and I don't know what the best answer is and how to deal with them right now. So put that in a box and just kind of be mulling it over for a few minutes. I'd like to read a portion from a book. It's The Scheme of Redemption, first published in 1868. So the copy that I have came from my grandfather. It's the 12th printing, so it's not from 1868, but I like to think it's really old. That something is always due to an offended and violated justice will perhaps be really, it says here, conceded by all. The father who never holds his children responsible for any of their misdemeanors will soon have a mortification of seeing all kinds of disorder prevailing in his family. And just so it is in the government of a school or a church, a state, or a nation. The demands of justice must be met and the majesty of the law sustained in every human organization. Or otherwise, the bonds of the association will soon be severed and anarchy and lawlessness will soon universally prevail. But what is it that is due to justice in such a case? What is sufficient to meet and to satisfy the claims of justice on account of transgressions committed in the family, the school, the church, the state, or the nation? Can anyone now answer this question clearly, definitely, and authoritatively? What should we do in our homes, in our schools, in our churches, in our nations? Can anyone answer that definitively? How many parents are able to decide with entire satisfaction, even to themselves, what they should and what they should not require of their offending children? But if this problem is so very difficult and embarrassing, even in its relations to the small and comparatively unimportant governments of this world, what does it become when it is extended to the vast empire of Jehovah? Who can say on what conditions a sin may and should be pardoned that has been committed against him who has established his throne in the heavens and whose kingdom rules over all? When you put it in that context, when we ask questions like, well, why did Jesus have to die? I think a fair question, and this is the apologetics light part of it. I don't have all the answers for when people say, why did Jesus have to die? But what I can say is this. When they say, well, why didn't God just set up a different system? Why did it have to be that system? My question then would be in response, I think a fair question for us to keep in our back pocket is, have you ever been a parent and not known how to manage an unruly child? Or have you ever been offended by someone and not known how to handle that situation? Have you not known, I don't know exactly what I want from them. I don't know, Steve has wronged me and I don't know exactly what Steve can do to make it right. Or I've wronged Steve and I don't know what to do to make it right. If we can't manage those relatively trivial things in our lives, then what makes us, what puts us in the position to question God in managing the entire world and all of his children? And so until Steve can tell me, I always know, sorry, you're here, so you're the guy today. And still, until Steve can answer and say, Eric, I know how to handle all situations. I've always, with perfect wisdom, managed my children. With perfect wisdom and love and grace and justice, I've always interacted with my fellow man every time without fail. Until we can say that, we are in no position to question God and the system in which he is set up to reconcile us to him. It's the equivalent, if you're familiar with Jordan B. Peterson, he is, there's some things that he says that aren't real great, but one of the things that I am very fond of, this is the spiritual equivalent of clean up your own room before you set out to rearrange the rest of the world. Why? And his question is, why should I trust you to tell me how the entire world should be organized when you showed up late for work today? When you didn't get your laundry done, when you didn't clean up your room, when there's dirty dishes in the sink, when all of these things in your own life aren't taken care of, why should I trust you to run my life? And until we can perfectly manage our own families and our own schools and our own churches and our own interactions with our brothers and sisters, until we always definitely have the perfect answer for that, we are in no position to question God and the system that he has set up to reconcile himself to us. You might wonder, is that the right thing? But you can't tell him it's wrong because you don't have the right answer either. So I think that is a fair way to at least introduce the idea of why did Jesus have to die when we are posed with that question. And I think that this problem might be unique to us today. Can we honestly say, as they did in 1868, that something is always due to offended and violated justice will perhaps be really conceded by all? Can we really say that in 2025? Is that if you were to poll the general public with this question, true or false, I don't know that you would have even a majority of people that would definitively agree with that. When politicians and even the prosecutors are being elected on campaigns that promise to decriminalize violent offenses. They run on the platform of we will make less things against the law. When society is blamed for the willful sins of those who abuse the weak, I think the answer is no. I don't think it will be really conceded by all that justice demands a sacrifice. We're living in a society that's different from when this was written. We have to acknowledge that we're living in a different world. We have to acknowledge that our presentation of the gospel needs to change as well. We need to have answers for these questions that maybe weren't posed 100 years ago. The question being asked today isn't why did Christ have to die? That's what the first century Jews, when you read through Hebrews, what is the question that the Hebrew writer is trying to answer? He's starting with the foundation that a sacrifice was necessary, and he's just making the argument that Christ's sacrifice was superior, that Christ's sacrifice was perfect. Jesus had to die because we needed a perfect sacrifice. That's the question the first century Jews were asking. That's not the question being asked today. The question that they were asking is, why did Jesus have to die? The question that we're answering today is, why did Jesus have to die? And those are two different questions. And we need to have at least a couple of things in our back pocket for whenever people stumble over this potential roadblock in our presentation of the gospel. And I'd like to make and we'll talk about it more in a few minutes, but make a distinction here. If you watch debates over questions like this, YouTube is full of better answers than what I can give you. There are hours and hours of excellent debates by like leading minds in the world on the topic of why did Jesus have to die. Watch those people. Don't listen to me. I've got pieces. But what I'm talking about and the things that I want us to go through in the next couple of classes are for those people who legitimately come to the gospel with roadblocks. I come to the gospel and I see like this doesn't, I had an unloving father. And whenever I see that God sent Jesus to die, I see an unloving father, and I don't want to have anything to do with that. There are things that we can do to talk to that man and work out the gospel with him. What I don't mean are the people that accuse God, like that just stand in the street and shout and accuse God. Well, God is a murderer because he killed Jesus and things like that. I think that is a pearls before swine situation. The people shouting at the sky, I will talk to them, but I'm not going to invest a whole bunch of time in them. That person's not interested in learning. I'm talking about the person sitting across the kitchen table from you that says, I came from an abusive home, and that looks like an abusive home. And we have to explain to them it's not abuse. Jesus wasn't punished with the cross. He gave himself on the cross because he loved you. Show them the other side of the coin. And so these are some of the things, roadblocks that I think that we might have today. A couple of things that we can work through with people whenever we're presented with a question, why did Jesus, not why did Jesus have to die, but why did Jesus have to die? Some things that we can kind of work through. If you'll turn, or I'll just read real quickly. In Psalm 5, we've read this passage several times in the last few classes, but a couple of things that we have to like lay a foundation for. One, a God who embodies holiness and righteousness cannot tolerate sin. So if he is a God that is the culmination of all holiness and all righteousness, he cannot abide with sin. Psalm 5 does a really good job of bringing this out. Verse 4, for you are not a God who delights in wickedness. Evil may not dwell with you. The boastful shall not stand before your eyes. You hate all evildoers. You destroy those who speak lies. The Lord abhors the bloodthirsty and deceitful man. God cannot abide. If he is truly all just and all holy and all righteous, he cannot abide with sin. And Psalm 5 brings that out. Now, if you keep reading through Psalm 5, he says, verse 7, but through the abundance of your steadfast love, I will enter your house. So it is not a God who is just out to wreak havoc on all sinners. He sees sin, sees that he cannot abide with it, and so he provides a way for us to be reconciled back to him. That's the whole point of what we've been talking about. A creator and a sustainer cannot tolerate rebellion, at least not in a healthy relationship. When parents tolerate rebellion in their children, they're not bringing peace to their home. When children rebel against their parents and they just ignore it, what you have is not peace. You have a temporary ceasefire. Those are two different things. So you've seen ceasefire in the news lately. That's different than peace. The ceasefire is, I still have animosity towards you. I'm still in rebellion against you, and you're still fighting back against me. But for right now, we're not going to shoot at each other. And that's what you have with parents who tolerate rebellion in their children. You have a temporary ceasefire. I'm going to let you rebel. I don't like it, and you don't like me, but I don't want us to argue, so I'm just going to not bring it up. That's a temporary ceasefire. They're not solving the actual problem. A God who embodies holiness and righteousness, he can't tolerate sin. He doesn't do ceasefires. He calls for peace. I ask you to turn to Romans 3. So we'll start there in Romans 3. Starting in verse 23, Paul says, for all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God, and are justified by his grace as a gift through the redemption that is in Christ Jesus. So we have sinners and we have redemption, whom God put forward as a propitiation by his blood to be received by faith. This is to. So why did God do this? We have sinners, we have redemption. It's through Christ Jesus. It's through Jesus' blood. Why? And Paul gives us an answer. It was to show God's righteousness. Because in his divine forbearance, he had passed over former sins. It was to show his righteousness at the present time so that he might be the just and the justifier of the one who has faith in Jesus. A question of why did Jesus have to die? Why couldn't we just kind of have the ceasefire? Why couldn't we tolerate some rebellion? Well, one answer is, at one time, God tried that. Paul says in Romans, in his divine forbearance, he passed over former sins. At one time, he said, look, okay, we've got blood of bulls, blood of goats, and we're going to just roll those sins forward. We're going to have a ceasefire. We're going to push them forward. They're always still there. We haven't really dealt with them. We're just managing them, and they're still piling up and piling up. But this, the sacrifice of Jesus, was to show his righteousness. It was to show his righteousness at the present time so that he could be the just and the justifier of the one who has faith in Christ Jesus. God says, look, I demand justice. As an all-righteous and all-holy God, the only thing that I can demand is justice. But through the sacrifice of Christ, I get to demand justice and be completely and wholly just. Also, I am the justifier. I am the one that accomplished that. And so what we see in the sacrifice of Christ is a God who embodies holiness and righteousness. For a very long time, God did pass over sin. Throughout the Old Testament, we see the sacrifices instituted that had to be carried out, but they never actually washed away sin. If you'll flip over to the book of Hebrews in the 10th chapter, the Hebrew writer here is dealing with this idea of the sacrifice of Christ and it being superior to the sacrifices in the old law. He says, starting in verse 1 of Hebrews 10, "For since the law had but a shadow of the good things to come, instead of the true form of these realities, it can never, by the same sacrifices that are continually offered every year, make perfect those who draw near. Otherwise, would they have not ceased to be offered, since the worshippers, having once been cleansed, would no longer have any consciousness of sins. But in these sacrifices there is a reminder of sins every year, for it is impossible for the blood of bulls and goats to take away sins." In the old law, there's the reminder. The sins are still there. That's why the reminder is there. We're still reminded every year, you're still in sin. You are still separated from God. Later in the chapter, we see how the sacrifice of Christ reveals God's righteousness, like what Paul talked about in Romans. Start reading in verse 12 with me. "But when Christ had offered for all time a single sacrifice for sins, he sat down at the right hand of God, waiting from that time until his enemies should be made a footstool for his feet. For by a single offering he has perfected for all time those who are being sanctified. And the Holy Spirit also bears witness to us, for after saying, 'This is the covenant that I will make with them in those days, declares the Lord, I will put my laws on their hearts and I will write them on their minds.' Then he adds, 'I will remember their sins and their lawless deeds no more.'" The preface to chapter 10 sums up this self-sacrificial aspect of the cross. If you look back in chapter 9, starting in verse 21, "Indeed, under the law, almost everything is purified with blood, and without the shedding of blood, there is no forgiveness of sins. Thus it was necessary for the copies of the heavenly things to be purified with these rites, but the heavenly things themselves with better sacrifices than these. For Christ has entered not into holy places made with hands, which are copies of the true things, but into heaven itself, now to appear in the presence of God on our behalf. Nor was it to offer himself repeatedly, as the high priest enters into the holy places every year with blood not his own, and then he would have had to suffer repeatedly since the foundation of the world. But as it is, he has appeared once for all at the end of the ages to put away sin by the sacrifice of himself." there's a distinction that people make sometimes, like, well, that's the Old Testament God. I want some of this New Testament God. The loving one, the Old Testament one, utterly wipe out the Amalekites. We got the earth opening up to swallow people, fire and brimstone raining down on Sodom and Gomorrah. We've got all these terrible things. I don't want that God. I want the New Testament God that loves me. We see a system in which in the Old Testament, God in his forbearance, he had patience. God tolerated sin. We looked at last on Wednesday. Was it Wednesday we looked at Jonah? Looked at Jonah on Wednesday. This is a man who runs away from God and God chases him down. And then he says, you know what? No, never mind. I would rather die. Throw me overboard. And he throws him overboard. He goes down to the bottom of the ocean and God says, no. I'm not going to let you. You don't get off that easy. And he sends a redeemer. He sends a great fish prepared for Jonah. I'm going to save you from yourself. Jonah repents, spits him out on the ground, goes to Nineveh, he preaches, then he goes up on top of the hill, he looks out, and what he's wanting to see is God's plan fail. That's what Jonah wants to see. An Old Testament God who's nothing but vengeance, at what point does he destroy Jonah? Like real early, Jonah is this long, right? So like we have a chapter, he ran away, God sent a storm, he died, the end. And that's not what you see in Jonah. At the very end, time and again, at the very end of the story, God says, okay, now we're going to have a conversation. I'm going to give you some shade to try to show you that you appreciate shade and I appreciate the people. And God is still trying to have long suffering with Jonah. In the Old Testament, he had patience. He tolerated sin among his people. But a king who continually tolerates rebellion without a plan to deal with it is not a king worthy of our worship. And that's something I would have in my back pocket when people ask, well, why would God have to do that? I don't want to worship a God who would sacrifice his son. Well, we've got to do something with the rebellion. Because a king who looks out over his kingdom, if you can just imagine a king, he looks out over his kingdom and there's rebellion here and rebellion there and everybody's doing their own thing. He's not a king at all. A king who tolerates rebellion, he's not worthy of our worship. This may be why so many people struggle with the sacrifice of Christ today. In a world where rebellion is seen as the rule rather than the exception, why wouldn't we expect anything else from God? In society, is rebellion generally accepted as tolerable? Among society at large, yes. And so that is a roadblock when we're going to go out. Okay, now we're going to take the gospel and we're going to go out to the world and we're going to tell the world, God doesn't tolerate rebellion. I'm like, well, why not? Because in my home, I do. And in my children's school, they do. And in my local government, they do. We live in a society that's different than 1868. And we have to have some ways to kind of manage that. So some things that we can kind of do to help course correct in society at least. Whenever we go out and we talk to people, a thing to keep in your back pocket, I think, a reasonable question to ask. And these aren't gotchas. I'm never going to be able to look at Paul and go, well, here's the thing, I got you. If I could just prove it, I could just read the Bible and prove it. But what we're trying to do is provoke thought. We're trying to give Paul doubt. Paul says, I don't believe in the gospel. I don't believe in the Bible because I don't believe that a loving God would sacrifice his son. Okay. Just think about this. Just chew on it for a while. And the thing that we can think about and kind of chew on for a while would be this question. If a king has a kingdom, and in that kingdom there's rebellion everywhere, and people not following the king, and he ignores it and does nothing, is he a king? And the answer is no. He's the puppet king. He's there on the throne, but he's not actually ruling anything. And if he is that king who tolerates rebellion and everybody does what they want, and he says, I'm the king, everybody, and you can just imagine there's total chaos everywhere. People running around doing their own thing, and then he's like, hey, I'm the king. Is that a king worthy of worship? And the answer is no. Okay, so if a king has to deal with rebellion in order to be worthy of worship, then it goes back to what we talked about at the first. Okay, well, how do we deal with that rebellion? And you ask, Steve, have you always perfectly managed all of your relationships? With your children, with your friends, with your family? And the answer is no. Have you ever not known how to deal with unruly children? Yes, I've had that problem. Well, then you're not qualified to tell the king how to deal with rebellion because you don't know either. But what we have is a king who says, I do have an answer, and does deal with dealing with the rebellion makes him worthy of worship. And if we don't know how to deal with rebellion in our own lives, then we're not qualified to tell him how to do it. So then we can set back, okay, now that we've established that, let's set back and kind of work our way through, okay, well, what does that plan actually look like? Some practical application kind of stuff. How we can course correct and at least set our own children up. You might not ever be able to convince the guy that you work with, or your neighbor, or someone in your family, but what we can do is influence our immediate family. Paul talked about this morning the importance of mothers raising children. What are some things that we can do? Now I'm going to give you a disclaimer from my grandfather. My grandfather told me once, he said, you know how before you're like 2 or 3 years old, like you don't remember a lot, like specific memories, like you don't really remember specific incidents before you're like 2 years old. He said, God made you that way so your parents could whip you real good and you wouldn't remember it. So when you turn 6, you think back, your parents whipped you a lot when you were 2. When you turn 6, you look at your dad and you're like, I should listen to him. I don't know why for sure. I don't remember the whippings. I don't remember him getting me, but I learned the lesson. The lesson gets planted deep inside of. For some reason, like I should listen to that guy, and I don't know why. That was my grandpa's stance, and apparently it took hold because it worked. It was my dad's also. This conversation that we're having, like where the rubber meets the road, what's something I could walk away with? I'm not having these conversations about the sacrifice of Christ with anybody that I know right now. What's something I can put in my back pocket and take home? Well, we can change our families. I can do that. I can change the culture in my family. And I think that this conversation about rebellion and how we deal with rebellion highlights the necessity of parents enforcing strict discipline in their homes with their children. Now, by that, I don't mean an excessive number of rules or harsh, overblown punishment when the rules are broken. That's not what I'm talking about. I believe that when parents say no, they should have a reason every time they say no. God has reasons for telling us what to do. And I think that when we tell our children no, I don't think it's a good idea to always tell your children no because it's more convenient for you. And no, can I do this? No. Well, why not? Well, because it would be mildly inconvenient for me, and I want you to go away and stop bothering me. I don't think that's a very good answer for parents to give. So I don't mean an excessive number of rules, or parents blowing up on their children, or beating them, or anything like that. I do mean a home where reasonable rules are established, and children are held to that standard unconditionally. Reasonable rules are established, and then we hold our children to them, especially at a young age. Now, there's a time for mercy. There's a time to introduce your children to the self-sacrificial love of Christ. That exists. Our children, we are our kids' first glimpse of God. And we need to introduce them to that self-sacrificial love of Christ and grace and mercy when they can recognize and appreciate it. But your children will never appreciate mercy until they have a full appreciation of discipline. Let me say that again. I don't believe children will ever appreciate mercy until they have a full appreciation for discipline. Otherwise, we end up with a generation who views Christ's sacrifice as just another example of their parents bailing them out of trouble. I've been present for too many young people. And by young people, I mean 15, like to young adulthood, to 25. I've seen too many 15 to 25-year-olds whose parents just repeatedly bail them out. There's never a consequence. They never deal with the rebellion. They just call a ceasefire. You did a thing. It's wrong. I'm going to kind of mitigate it so that there's no more drama. What we don't need are children growing up thinking that whenever I'm baptized, that's God bailing me out of trouble. And that my prayers for forgiveness are God bailing me out of trouble. I can do these things and I keep doing them because I know if I just call Dad, He'll come help. If that's the culture that we raise our children and our grandchildren in, that you can do whatever you want to, I'll always show up and I'll always bail you out with no consequences, we're going to have children who don't fully appreciate the sacrifice of Christ. They're going to view the water of baptism as God bailing them out. And every time they pray, they're going to see it as a get-out-of-jail-free card. God's holiness demanded that an atonement be made for sin so that He could be reconciled with us. Something had to be done about that. God clearly doesn't want men to act in certain ways and do certain things. But from what's revealed in the Bible to us, it's clear that God has expectations for mankind. A judge who demands justice. I got a question for you. A judge that demands justice, who claims to be the pinnacle of holiness and righteousness, but he turns a blind eye when his children break the law and he never brings them to trial. What would we call that judge? What's a word that could be used to describe him? Hypocrite. That's what I had written down. We would call that judge a hypocrite. I am the judge and I hold people accountable. Except when it's my kids. He's a hypocrite, and a hypocritical judge is not worthy of our worship. He gets ousted in the next election, right? We call for him to have to step down. That's not the kind of God that we want. Who, if you're in the modern workforce, if I can get a show of hands, who here has ever in the last few years heard the word authentic or heard pleas for authenticity? Yeah, when you deal, that's that. Authenticity, being true to yourself. If you haven't heard it in the workforce, you've seen it in Disney movies. Being true to your real self is the ultimate. This is the ultimate goal, is just be true to yourself. Worse yet, that's a judge who's not authentic. In a culture that demands authenticity from its people, we demand a God who's not authentic to Himself. He claims to be all just and all holy and all righteous. He claims that He cannot abide with sin. In a society who claims that being true to yourself and speaking your truth into the world are the highest virtues, would we want a God who wasn't authentic to His true personality? We shouldn't. God claims that He cannot tolerate sin. And then if He does it, it makes Him inauthentic. It makes Him a hypocritical judge. An argument in 2025 then could look something like this. Without an atonement being necessary, God claims God is not worthy of our worship because. So we're trying to make the case. An atonement was necessary. The sacrifice was necessary. Something had to happen. Okay. Without an atonement being necessary, God is not worthy of our worship. Why not? Because if an atonement isn't necessary, God's claims to holiness are a lie, and liars are not worthy of worship. These are things that we can keep in our back pocket. God claims to be holy. If He tolerates rebellion and He tolerates sin, He says, I will not abide with sin. If He does abide with sin, it makes Him a liar. And liars aren't worthy of worship. What people want is to say, I worship God. They want to say, I follow God. They want to say, I honor God. But then the God that they set up is this puppet king. What they really mean is, I want a God who just lets me do whatever I want to. Yes.
Back to your chapter, Romans chapter 3, I think that's the very point that starts the chapter.
Yeah.
And otherwise, he would be a liar.
Yeah, absolutely. Without an atonement being necessary, God is not worthy of our worship, because if an atonement is necessary but ignored, right? So through the first one, we say, okay, listen, if an atonement isn't necessary, God's claim to holiness are a lie. Liars are not worthy of worship. Okay, well, God's not a liar, so an atonement must be necessary. He says he can't abide by sin. Okay, I believe that. So God's not a liar. Well, if the atonement is necessary then, but God ignored it, he's a hypocrite. And hypocrites are not worthy of our worship. Just like the judge who says, I stand for justice, but I ignore it when my kids do it, when my favorite people do it. That's a hypocrite. We call for them to be removed. If an atonement isn't necessary, then God's a liar and we shouldn't worship him. If an atonement is necessary but ignored, God is a hypocrite and we shouldn't worship him then either. All the roads that the world has set up to this all lead to us not worshiping God. Just completely ignore him. You can't set him up as a puppet king. You have to accept an omnipotent God as he is, not as you want him to be. Forgiveness is only necessary because God set a standard of right and wrong. I think that's a fair statement to make. Forgiveness is only necessary because God set a standard of right and wrong. Only a just God would have the authority to set that standard. Like, who has the right to tell me what's right and wrong? Only a God who is completely just. Okay, all right, so God must be just then if he has set the standard of right and wrong. A just God cannot forgive a sinner without being redeemed, without there being something to fix that relationship. His wrath being appeased, his relationship being reconciled. If he is truly all just, then those things have to happen. And if we're the sinner, we don't have any standing to decide how that happens. You don't get to decide. I don't get to wrong Carl. I don't get to steal his car tomorrow and then say, listen, Carl, I stole your car. I've decided this is how I'm going to make it right with you. I don't get to decide that. All of the roads, all of the arguments of a sacrifice not being necessary and the sacrifice of Christ being the ultimate sacrifice is what the Hebrew writer is saying. All the roads of saying a sacrifice is not necessary lead to us not worshiping God. Because it either makes him a liar, or it makes him a hypocrite, or it makes him someone who shouldn't have told me what's right and wrong. It makes him not just. And if he's not just, well then you don't get to tell me what's right and wrong anyway, and I can just do whatever I want to. Without a sacrifice being necessary, without the sacrifice being necessary, God's not a God that's worthy of worship. And so then I think a fair question to ask is God a God who's worthy of worship? Yes. If he is, then he is just. And he has the right to decide how to fix this how to mend this broken relationship. The bell is just about to ring. The only thing that we didn't get to, and we don't need to go through all the passages. There's stuff that's familiar with all of us. But the question of why did Jesus have to die also overlooks the fact that Jesus was a willing participant in the crucifixion. God didn't punish Jesus by putting him on the cross. Jesus put himself on the cross because he loved us. Those are two different things. It's not punishment, it's sacrifice, a willing sacrifice. And that is a different way to look at Jesus. The question of why did Jesus have to die? Okay, so where we're going from here. On Wednesday, if we make the case, God demanded an atonement. Like the system that God set up demands an atonement. Only a holy God can demand this atonement. And God is holy, so the atonement is necessary. So we've got that. From there, on Wednesday, we're going to look at the idea, okay, well, why did God set it up where an atonement might be necessary? Why does God allow sin and by extension suffering? Why didn't God just make a world where I couldn't sin? And then none of that would be necessary. That would be the next logical question, I think, in the progression as we talk to people. Why did Jesus have to die? Well, because of these reasons. Okay, well then why didn't God just make a world where there's no sin? And that's what we're going to look at on Wednesday. The bell's just about to ring, so we'll go ahead and stop. Thank you all for your comments.